So everyone has been talking about the Federal Reserve lately. I know a little about the Fed from college, but we only skimmed over it a little bit. Do you know much about the Fed?
Yes. I know that it is a privately owned central bank of the United States that has the power to control the money supply and the interest rates that banks loan money at.
What does this bank do?
The purpose of a central bank is to lend money to a government and to keep an economy stable.
But doesn't Congress already have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof?
Yes, but it decided in 1913 to give that power to a privately owned bank. That idea was that political influences wouldn't be able to influence the money supply and that only a private corporation would be able to do what is best for the economy.
So, let me get this straight. Congress gave up its power to regulate money to a private corporation that they would now have to borrow from?
That is correct.
And how exactly does giving power to a private corporation to control the money supply of a country benefit the people of the United States?
Well, it benefits the people because it provides an elastic currency or elasticity to the money supply. This means that the Federal Reserve can inflate or deflate the money supply depending on the condition of the economy at the time.
I see. All I know is that if me and my buddies had the power to inflate or deflate the amount of money in circulation, we would be really tempted to do this for our own profit and benefit. Don't you think that giving the Federal Reserve that amount of power has the potential to corrupt them?
Absolutely. That is why in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 the President was given the power to appoint a chairman, or head, of the Federal Reserve. The idea was to make sure that the Federal Reserve was kept in check by the representative of the people.
Yeah, but what happens if there is a president that is corrupt?
Well, hopefully that never happens.
Interesting. So, I'm still confused over this money borrowing thing. You mean to tell me that the Congress had the power to regulate money and gave up that power to a private corporation that it must now borrow from?
Yes. Okay, dude, you're really starting to annoy me. Get to the point.
So how does this process work? There is only a certain amount of money in circulation. This is why I'm confused.
All right, here it goes. Congress wants to make a law that would provide federal money for schools. The problem is that it doesn't have enough money through taxes in order to do this. What do you do when you don't have enough money and need something right away? Use up that credit card. Think of the Fed as Congress' credit card. So, the bill for federal funding for schools gets passed. The U.S. Treasury calls up the Federal Reserve and says, "Hey, we need $100 million for the new bill we just passed." So, the U.S. Treasury sells $100 million in what are known as Treasury bonds, or T-bills, to the Federal Reserve. Basically, this means that the U.S. Treasury is selling debt to the Fed. Then, the Fed prints out some nice U.S. dollars, Federal Reserve notes, to the value of $100 million.
Word. So, the Federal Reserve will have to take some of its reserve money from the other regional Federal Reserve branches in order to come up with the $100 million, right?
Well, not exactly. That $100 million is created because the Treasury agreed to go into debt.
So, the $100 million is created out of nothing.
It is created by agreement that the U.S. Treasury will pay back that money with interest.
So, who benefits from this then?
Well, everyone benefits from it. The schools get federal funding, Congress passes a law that benefits those schools and have a better chance of getting re-elected, and the Federal Reserve gets interest payments from the U.S. Treasury.
Yeah, but what about the people that didn't benefit from federal funding for schools? Since $100 million is created out of nothing, doesn't that mean that their dollar loses value, like orange juice when you dilute and add water to it? I think that politicians and bankers benefit from this arrangement and not the American people.
How so, Smarty Pants?
Well, if politicians can just walk over to the Fed and ring up the credit card whenever they want to, then they can act like they're doing something all the time. They can create government programs from borrowing money, and by the time the bills are due, they are long gone. Also, politicians have a way for paying for these programs without taxing the American people. Since people don't see an increase in their taxes, They don't complain. However, what really happens is that the purchasing power of their dollar goes down a little bit every year, which is a hidden tax. Bankers may benefit from this arrangement, because the more the U.S. government goes in debt, the more interest they can collect from that debt. So, the Federal Reserve can just sit back and let the government borrow as much as it wants, because someday the bills are going to be due?
You bring up good points, but I happen to disagree with you. The American people benefit tremendously from this arrangement. Under this banking system, if anyone needs credit, it is available because it can be created at banks. Under the old system, it was much harder to borrow money because there was a limited supply of money. Look at the progress the United States has made under the Federal Reserve System since 1930. It has been the engine that drives our economy and keeps it stable. Without it, you would have to save much more in order to be able to buy stuff. Now, you can just borrow most of the money and pay it back at your leisure.
Yeah, but I hope you can see my point also. It is much more tempting for a government to go to war under this arrangement. Before the Federal Reserve, in order to go to war, the federal government would have to directly raise taxes or borrow a ton of money from a foreign country. Now, all the U.S. government has to do is sell some T-bills to the Federal Reserve and you have a war without having to directly tax the American people. Instead of directly taxing the American people, the value of the dollar goes down instead. This is how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are not that popular at this time, have been paid for. The more money the federal government borrows, the more interest the banks make on its debts.
Yes, it makes it easier to borrow money for war, but is that necessarily a bad thing? Instead of having to borrow from a foreign bank at high interest, why not borrow from your own? Besides, the war was approved through the proper channels of government before we could agree to give the loan. We are just giving money to the representatives you chose in the voting booth.
Yes, I know. But there is enormous potential for corruption if both the government and the banks at the same time benefit from war. Also, there is tremendous power for corruption if a private corporation, of unelected bankers of which we do not know who own the shares of the company and has never been audited, controls the supply of money for an entire nation. Since the federal government has to go to the Federal Reserve for money, doesn't that imply that the Federal Reserve owns the federal government? It seems like the enormous probability for corruption at the expense of the American people makes it unlikely that this arrangement is beneficial for the American people.
Well, Mom, I couldn't disagree with you more. Under a gold/silver standard, the average person would not be able to get the credit they need to purchase large items like homes, cars, etc. I think the ability to borrow money easily has led to the standard of living of Americans to be higher than any other nation in the history of the world. Yes, this leads to a small devaluation of the dollar, but it is hardly noticeable as long as wages are adjusted for inflation.
Well, it was great talking to you, sir. I always love intellectual debate when the person I am debating is mature enough to debate without hurling personal insults. Thank you for your time.